So a cramp, basically the difference between a contracture and a cramp is involuntary, right? It's basically like an undesired contraction, and a contracture would be like a voluntary shortening of muscle, so a purposeful movement or something like that.
But not physiologically, it's different.
Yeah.
It still goes through the whole.
Yeah,
thing.
but usually a cramp would be involved with a dysfunction in that process. For example, we talked about acetylcholine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you it's called acetylcholine esterase. It's what breaks down acetylcholine and puts it back up into the synaptic terminal, right? And so if there's constant acetylcholine present and it wasn't taken back up, that means that from there on there'd be muscle contraction, right? Even though you've stopped the action potential, right? You're like, don't contract, but it's still kind of contracting, right? And then we've got this thing on calcium, right? So
that could cause a cramp if the acetylcholine esterase wasn't working?
Yeah, if you had some type of problem with that. Usually it's involved with an imbalance of electrolytes, right? So your calcium, potassium, sodium levels.
So in this one where it says, how would hypocalcemia cause a muscle cramp?
Mm-hmm.
So that's not enough calcium. Why would that cause a muscle cramp?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Also, I have another question. So, like, when you're, like, exercising and say you're, like, stretching and you get into a position and all of a sudden your muscle cramps because it was, like, too long in that position or whatever, why is it that it does that? Like, where did it mess up?
Well, there's a couple of things in there because we could get into, like, muscle spindles, right? Did you learn about those?
No. I guess if it's too
complicated. Yeah, don't tell us.
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors. Like with stretching, for example, you have these things called muscle spindles, and they basically monitor how long your muscles are and how fast they lengthen. And if a muscle lengthens really quickly, it'll cause that muscle to do the opposite and contract, right? For example, like when you nod off to sleep, like your head bobs back up. It's because the muscles in the back of your neck are lengthening really fast. And that's not normal. And so your body will shorten those muscles and pop your head back up, type of thing. Or like the knee-jerk reflex when they do that. It's because like in the patellar tendon, you're lengthening those muscle spindles really fast. And so it causes the muscle to contract and do that. And so, and in smaller areas and with stretching and stuff, it could cause a cramp. But usually if it's a cramp that's not from like over stretching, it usually has to do with like some type of fatigue or you just have an imbalance of electrolytes and stuff. So, but I'm trying to find specifically how.
Not enough calcium.
Yeah. Let's see. So this says electrolyte disturbance may cause cramping, particularly hypokalemia, so which is potassium, and then hypocalcemia. The disturbance arises as the blood loses large amounts of interstitial fluid through sweat, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the loss of osmotic active particles. Oh, okay. So this is saying, so when you lose a lot of calcium, it messes with, it's called the osmotic pressure. I don't know. Okay, so that's basically like when you have fluids that are more highly concentrated and less, there's
the one
that's more concentrated, right? And so it messes with that balance, right? When you start losing ions, then that fluid balance kind of changes. And it says that this causes the calcium pump between the muscle sarcoplasm and the sarcoplasmic reticulum to short circuit. The calcium ions remain bound to troponin, continuing muscle contraction. So basically what happens is hypocalcemia causes in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right, this circa pump. It basically messes it up, right? And so there's no reuptake of calcium. And so even though you've stopped letting it out, the calcium remains bound to...
And just is the osmotic pressure the one that breaks that?
Yeah,
caused
and
by
yeah,
too much.
and this isn't a very good
calcium.
example. It says the loss of osmotically active particles outside muscle cells leads to a disturbance of the osmotic balance and therefore shrinking of muscle cells, as these contain more osmotically active particles. This causes the calcium pump between the muscle sarcoplasmic reticulum to short circuit. That's not very
That's okay.
good, like short circuit. I mean, it doesn't like really short circuit, but yeah. So it's got to do with like osmotic pressures and like the shrinking of the muscles from that pressure because they're losing more fluid, or gaining more fluid, like stretching and stuff,
So
and so it
it
messes
just-
with the this pump.
So it's pretty much the hypocalcemia causes the ATP pump to stop working, which is what we were talking about
Mhm.
before. It's just a, more technical term.
Yeah, because if you had hypercalcemia,
Would that do the same thing too?
it probably wouldn't do much because your body's really good at storing calcium, and
so
so
you just take
it-
out the extra.
yeah, or like in your blood, your body would actually secrete hormones, which you'll learn about, and it would cause the calcium in your blood to be deposited in your bones, right? So your bones are actually not only structure, right, but they store your body's calcium. So when you need calcium, your body like activates osteoclasts and they like eat away at your bones and raise your blood calcium levels. If it gets too high, it does the opposite and deposits it, right? And so usually you run into problems if you don't have enough electrolytes, right? It's harder to like eat too much. Like you could eat way too much salt, like if you drink seawater, that would mess stuff up because it would cause water to go into the gut, right? Instead of like the opposite. And that messes stuff up, but usually people drink salt water. Usually it's like your body's pretty good at taking care of those things. It doesn't do as good with deficiencies because it has
Creating
nothing.
its own.
Yeah, it has nothing to work
That makes
with, right?
sense.
So, yeah.
So it says different types. Describe the characteristics of muscle fatigue and the different types of muscle fibers. What are the different types of muscle fibers?
Okay, so you've got
Fast and slow.
yeah, so you got type 1, and then you've got type
This is when you take those notes.
Two.
Does that make it? Remember that?
Well, I kind of just stopped.
A and X, right? Okay, so so different types of muscle fatigue. It explains in your book. There's like psychological fatigue. There's
Muscular fatigue, synaptic fatigue.
yeah, right. Synaptic fatigue would be like, because even like we're talking about acetylcholine, right? If it keeps binding, eventually the ligand channel will be less receptive to open and close as actively. Because if you overstimulate a neuron, eventually it'll kind of stop firing as strong, right? And then muscular fatigue, I don't know.
Results from calcium ion imbalances as
Yeah.
ATP drops without adequate ATP levels in muscle fibers.
Yeah.
Cross bridges and
So
So-
just has
So
to do ATP.
down ATP, down muscle tension.
Yeah, because you need a balance of ATP and calcium for muscle contraction to occur properly. If you mess with that, you'll get problems, fatigue or spasm, or what we call it, cramping, right? So, and then psychological fatigue. I don't know if it talks about that, but
Time,
Really?
just, yeah.
Your
Yeah.
muscles can do more.
Depends
but
on your
yeah.
emotional state.
yeah. Okay, but so muscle fiber types, they mostly break down into type 1 and type 2. And type 2 splits up into A and X. Type 1 are going to be your aerobic muscles, the ones involved with aerobic metabolism. So sustained action, basically. Like if you're going to a long run, right, you'd be using mostly type 1 muscle fiber.
Which one's fast and what one's slow?
Slow twitch is type 1, and fast twitch is type 2. So this is slow, fast.
So slow is aerobic, fast is anaerobic.
Yeah, So type 2 is more, you have much higher force production. So this is for like explosive movements or for
But
like,
they don't last very long.
yeah, because you're anaerobic, so you're producing lactic acid and other metabolic byproducts that basically start shutting down the process, right? Like you can't sprint as fast as you can forever, right? Because eventually you can't get the oxygen to the muscle fast enough for it to generate metabolism. So you start running out of ATP, you start producing lactic acid, ouch, it starts hurting, and then you have to like slow down, right? And so, yeah, they also look a little bit different. Type 1 is mostly like darker muscle, or like dark meat, if you see on like a turkey or whatever,
Yeah.
or like migratory birds, like ducks, for example, their breast meat is mostly dark, right? Because they depend on flying for long periods of time and stuff. But other ones, like chickens, they don't really fly, and so they have a lot of type 2. And so that has to do with like mitochondrial density and capillary density
Yeah,
and stuff.
I think this is what he just wanted us to know, is how to make fast twitch a more fatigue resistant. You have to have more glycogen, mitochondria, myoglobin, and blood supply.
I did write that
I
part.
think that's the only thing you really talked about, but okay. I think we're
Also,
good.
okay, also
No,
really
it's
quick,
fine.
so fast twitch, they're innervated by like bigger nerves, so they're harder to stimulate. So whenever you do any action, you're always recruiting type 1s first and then type 2. That makes sense? So you're always using type 1, and then if the stimulus requires more force reduction, you'll recruit
So does
type
the
2.
fast one have more summation ones since they're bigger neurons?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So talking is slow twitch.
What?
Talking is slow
slow?
twitch.
Talking? Yeah. Yeah.
I
Like stuff that doesn't really require energy. Like I probably haven't recruited any type 2s this whole time I've been there, right?
Oh wow.
Because, I'm weak and, like
but if
it-
someone came up behind you trying to kill you,
Yeah, and I
you
was
started
like,
clicking it, or
Yeah.
that's fast.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
basically.
I think we're good.
Cool.
I did have one more question. Sorry.
Yep.
Okay. How do all things discussed in the neuromuscular junction and muscle fiber react during muscle reaction or relaxation?
Relaxation.
So, like with relaxation, the calcium goes back into the SR,
Mm-hmm.
and then like what happens
Yeah.
here?
So this is basically what happens. So acetylcholine is broken down by acetylcholinesterase, reuptake into the terminal, right? And then they form acetylcholine in vesicles again. Basically like goes back to like starting position,
Okay.
right? So it kind of recycles everything, brings it back, balances out all the ions where they were before, and just
Okay.
chills
Waits
out.
until
Just
another
waits, yeah.
action potential.
Yeah.
Okay.